let me ask you something. Have you ever sat there listening to somebody tell a lie so bold, so downright shameless, that you almost admired the nerve it took to say it? Because that's exactly what happened 3 days after we buried my grandfather. My father stood on the front porch of our family home, looked me square in the eye, and announced that I wasn't getting a single red cent from the estate. Not $1, not 1 acre, not one piece of the business I'd spent most of my life helping run. Now here's the kicker. He wasn't just saying it to me. He made sure the whole family was standing there to hear it. The cousins, the neighbors, the old family friends, everybody. And while they stood there waiting for me to break down, cry, or cause a scene, I did something that caught them all off guard. I stayed quiet. Because unlike my father, I knew something he didn't. The books never lie. And I'd spent over 20 years keeping them. Boy, was he about to learn that lesson the hard way. My name is Avery May. I was 34 years old when my father tried to steal my grandfather's legacy. My grandfather, Walt May, was one of those old-school men who built everything with his own 2 hands. No shortcuts. No handouts. No fancy investors. Just hard work, grit, and enough stubbornness to move a mountain. He owned May Brothers Feed and Grain, a small business sitting on the edge of a quiet Ohio town. If you grew up around there, you knew that store. The old brass bell hanging above the front door announced every customer who walked in. The place smelled like grain dust, coffee, diesel fuel, and honest work. To me, it smelled like home. I practically grew up behind that counter. At 9 years old, Grandpa trusted me to ring up customers. At 11, he trusted me with something even more important, the books. Now, when Grandpa handed me that green ledger, it wasn't just a notebook. It was the heartbeat of the business. Every sale, every payment, every debt, every dollar, everything got written down. Walt May had a memory sharp enough to remember what somebody owed him 10 years ago, but he still recorded every penny. One afternoon, I finally asked him why. Grandpa, if you already remember everything, why write it all down? He looked up from his coffee, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug. Then he gave me an answer I'd never forget. The books don't lie, Avery. He paused. People do. At the time, I figured it was just one of those old sayings folks repeat. Years later, I'd realize it was the most valuable lesson he ever taught me. Because while Grandpa trusted the books, my father trusted something else. Appearances. My father, Dale, loved looking important. He liked being the loudest voice in the room, the guy shaking hands, the guy giving speeches, the guy everybody noticed. Meanwhile, Grandpa and I were the ones handling the actual work. Whenever the store needed records organized, I did it. When tax paperwork came around, I handled it. When bills needed sorting, I handled those too. I knew every corner of that business, every account, every parcel of land, every piece of paperwork. For more than 2 decades, I helped keep everything running. And then Grandpa got sick. At first, it was small things. Forgetting appointments, getting tired easier, moving slower. But before long, everybody knew something was wrong. The store got quieter. The brass bell rang less often. Grandpa spent more time sitting than standing. And eventually, the ledger stayed closed more days than open. Then one September morning, we got the call we'd all been dreading. Walt May was gone. The funeral brought half the county through the church doors. Folks came from everywhere. Some brought casseroles. Some brought flowers. Most brought stories. Because that's what happens when a good man spends his life helping people. But while everyone else seemed focused on remembering Grandpa, my father seemed focused on something else, the estate. At first, I ignored it. Grief makes people act strange. But by the very next morning, Dad already had keys to every property. He had a lawyer's business card in his pocket. And he was acting less like a grieving son and more like a man taking inventory. Something about it rubbed me the wrong way. Then I asked one simple question. When are we reading Grandpa's will? Dad didn't even look up from his coffee. There isn't one. I froze. Because I knew that wasn't true. 6 years earlier, I'd driven Grandpa to a lawyer's office in the county seat. I remembered sitting in the waiting room. I remembered seeing him sign papers. I remembered him walking out smiling afterward. Most of all, I remembered exactly what he told me. I finally got everything in order. So I looked right at my father. Dad, I was there. He slowly set down his coffee cup. The look on his face lasted maybe half a second. Then it disappeared. Avery, he said, grief plays tricks on people. I knew right then something wasn't right, but I had no idea how deep this thing went. And I sure didn't know my father was already setting the biggest lie of his life into motion. A few days later, standing on Grandpa's front porch, my father publicly announced who would inherit everything. And when he pointed at me and told the entire family I was getting nothing, he accidentally made the mistake that would destroy his whole plan. Because that same night, I started digging into the paperwork, and what I found made my stomach drop. Here's where things started smelling fishier than a bait shop in July. My father had just stood on Grandpa's porch and told the whole family I wasn't getting a dime. Most people would have gone home angry. Some would have cried. Others would have started a family shouting match right there on the front lawn.
But not me.
Because whenever life knocks me sideways, I do the same thing I've always done. I start looking at the paperwork. And let me tell you, the paperwork was about to tell a very different story than my father was selling. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, I stopped thinking like a granddaughter. I started thinking like someone who worked in probate law. You see, helping people sort out estates was part of my job. I'd spent years watching families tear themselves apart over money. And one thing I knew for certain was this. When somebody starts rushing paperwork after a death, there's usually a reason. So I wrote a single word across the top of the page. Questions. The first question came easy. If Grandpa really died without a will, why was Dad acting like everything already belonged to him? That wasn't how estate administration worked. Not even close. Administrators managed assets. They didn't automatically own them. Yet Dad was walking around like he'd already won the lottery. That bothered me. The next Monday, I took my lunch break and drove straight to the county courthouse. If Dad had opened probate proceedings, there would be records. And records don't care about anybody's feelings. Records tell the truth. I pulled the estate file and carried it to a quiet table. Then I started reading. The deeper I got, the tighter my stomach became. There it was. My father had officially filed to become administrator of Grandpa's estate. The store, the farmland, the house, everything. And according to the filing, Grandpa had supposedly died without a will. I read the page twice, then 3 times. The law itself wasn't surprising. If there truly wasn't a will, my father would inherit everything.
Not me.
Not my brother Cole.
Dad.
Every bit of it. That part checked out. What didn't check out was Dad's behavior. Most people in that position would still be sorting through paperwork. Dad was already acting like the king had been crowned. Like he knew there was no chance anyone would challenge him. That confidence bothered me more than anything. I sat in my car afterwards staring at the courthouse steps. Something wasn't adding up. Either Grandpa never made a will, or somebody desperately wanted everyone to believe he hadn't. And I knew which explanation felt more likely, because I'd seen him sign one with my own eyes. The more I thought about it, the more another detail started nagging at me. Dad's lawyer. The attorney handling everything was named Garrett Voss. Now, folks, I knew that name. Not personally, but professionally. And let's just say, he wasn't exactly famous for making things easy. The filing also requested something called independent administration. Less court oversight, less supervision, less accountability. Basically, fewer eyes looking over my father's shoulder. Well, that sure didn't make me feel any better. I closed the file and leaned back in my seat. Then I said something out loud that made a few people glance my way. If there's really no will, why is he in such a hurry? Because here's the thing. People who have nothing to hide don't usually rush. People who are telling the truth don't usually panic. And they definitely don't try to control every piece of information. That's when I decided to stop wondering. I was going to start asking questions. Officially, professionally, and in writing. The kind of writing that leaves a paper trail. Because Grandpa taught me something years ago. A lie can travel pretty far. But eventually it runs headfirst into a document. And documents don't get nervous. Documents don't forget. Documents don't change their story. The very next day, I drafted a formal request asking for a complete inventory of the estate. Every account, every asset, every transaction made since Grandpa's death. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. Then I mailed it certified. That way nobody could pretend it never arrived. When I dropped the envelope into the mailbox, my hands shook a little. Not because I was scared, because deep down I had a feeling. A strong one. The kind that settles in your bones. The kind that tells you you're about to uncover something you can't put back. And folks, that feeling turned out to be right. Because 4 days later, a letter arrived from Dad's attorney. And what it didn't contain told me more than anything it did. Instead of answering my questions, Dad's lawyer sent me a warning. No inventory. No records. No explanations. Just a threat wrapped in fancy legal language. And the moment I read it, I knew somebody was hiding something. What happened next would lead me straight to a signature that shouldn't have existed and a secret land deal worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know what usually happens when you ask an honest question? You get an answer. Maybe not the answer you wanted, but an answer all the same. But when somebody's hiding something, that's when the dancing starts. That's when the excuses show up. That's when people suddenly get real interested in changing the subject. And let me tell you, after I sent that request for Grandpa's estate records, my father's lawyer started tap dancing like his shoes were on fire. That's when I knew I was getting close to something. Real close. 4 days after mailing my request, a letter arrived from Garrett Voss. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it. At first glance, it looked official enough. Fancy letterhead. Legal language. Lots of words. The problem was there weren't any answers. No inventory. No accounting. No list of assets. Nothing I'd actually requested. Instead, the letter claimed my questions were causing unnecessary stress for a grieving family. According to Voss, the estate process was still in its early stages. According to Voss, my inquiries were creating conflict. According to Voss, I should basically back off and let things proceed. I read the letter twice, then a third time, and by the end of it, I found myself smiling. Not because it was funny, because it told me exactly what I needed to know. You see, folks, honest people usually hand over records. People with nothing to hide don't send warnings. They don't hide behind legal jargon. They don't try to make you feel guilty for asking simple questions. The inventory should have been easy to provide. Instead, they sent a threat wrapped in polite language. And that told me more than any accounting ever could. Somebody was protecting something. The only question was what. A few days later, I got another surprise. My younger brother Cole showed up at my apartment. Now Cole and I had always been close growing up. Not perfect, but close. He was 4 years younger than me and had always been the easygoing one. The kind of guy who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 10 new friends. But when I opened the door that afternoon, he looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Shoulders slumped. Worried. He was carrying a grocery store pie, like some kind of peace offering. And before he even sat down, I knew exactly why he was there. Dad had sent him. We sat at the kitchen table. I cut 2 slices of pie. For a few minutes, we talked about normal things.
The baby. His wife. Work.
Bills.
Life.
Then he finally got to the real reason for his visit. Dad says you're making things harder than they need to be. There it was. I took a sip of coffee. Didn't argue. Didn't interrupt. Just listened. According to Cole, Dad was trying to keep the family together. Dad was trying to protect Grandpa's legacy. Dad was trying to do what was best for everybody. The more Cole talked, the more familiar it sounded. Because he wasn't speaking for himself. He was repeating Dad's talking points almost word for word. Same phrases. Same explanations. Same excuses. It was like listening to a recording. And suddenly I felt sorry for him. Because my brother wasn't the mastermind here. He was another person Dad was using. Finally, Cole leaned back and crossed his arms. Dad says Grandpa would have wanted a man running things. I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, Because Grandpa cared about competence. Not gender. Not titles. Not appearances. Competence. And if Grandpa had trusted anyone with the books for over 20 years, it sure wasn't my father. Still, I kept my mouth shut. Instead, I reached into my folder and slid a copy of the probate filing across the table. Cole glanced down, then frowned. "What's this?" I pointed to a signature near the bottom. His signature. The color drained right out of his face. For several seconds, he just stared. Then he looked up at me. "What is this?" Asked a simple question. "Did you actually read what you signed?" The room went quiet. Real quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you somebody just realized they've stepped into something much bigger than they thought. Finally, Cole shook his head. "No." His voice barely came out above a whisper. Dad had handed him a stack of documents. Told him where to sign. Told him it was routine. And my exhausted brother, juggling a newborn baby and a mountain of bills, had trusted him. He signed without reading. Every single page. That's when something clicked for me. Dad wasn't just controlling the estate. He was controlling information. Keeping people tired. Keeping people confused. Keeping people dependent. And as long as nobody asked questions, his plan worked just fine. But the moment somebody started reading the fine print, things got dangerous. Before leaving, Cole sat quietly at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at me. For the first time all afternoon, he sounded like himself. Not Dad's messenger. Not Dad's defender. Just my little brother. "What do you think is really going on?" I looked at the lawyer's letter sitting on the table. Then at the courthouse records. Then at my brother. And I answered honestly. "I think Grandpa's will existed." I paused. "And I think somebody really doesn't want us to find it." The look on Cole's face told me he was starting to think the same thing. That night, after Cole left, I pulled out years of old records and receipts from Grandpa's business. At first, I was only looking for answers. Instead, I found a land transfer with a signature that made my blood run cold. Because whoever signed that document was pretending to be my grandfather. And what I uncovered next would blow this entire case wide open. One thing I've learned in life is this. Most lies don't fall apart all at once. They unravel thread by thread. One little detail. One tiny mistake. One thing somebody thought nobody would ever notice. And when you've spent most of your life keeping books, balancing accounts, and checking records, those little mistakes practically glow in the dark. That's exactly what happened a few days after my conversation with Cole. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was just looking for the truth. Instead, I stumbled onto something that made my stomach drop. Because somebody had signed my grandfather's name. And it sure didn't look like my grandfather did it. The weekend after Cole's visit, I turned my kitchen table into a temporary office. Folders everywhere. Receipts. Bank records. Tax documents. Old business papers. Anything connected to Grandpa's affairs. Over the years, I'd taken home plenty of paperwork to help with bookkeeping. Most of it was ordinary stuff. Nothing exciting. But ordinary paperwork has a funny way of exposing extraordinary lies. I spent hours sorting through documents, line by line, page by page, the same way Grandpa taught me. Slow, careful, patient. And eventually something caught my attention. 2 property transfers. Both dated about 4 months before Grandpa died. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I would have remembered major land transfers, especially involving some of Grandpa's most valuable acreage. Yet somehow, these documents had never crossed my desk. That alone was strange. Then I noticed the buyer, a company called Riverbend Holdings. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. And that was another problem, because in a town our size, people usually know who's buying farmland, especially farmland worth serious money. Yet I'd never heard of Riverbend Holdings before. Not once. I started reading more carefully. The deeper I got, the worse it looked. According to the documents, Grandpa had sold 2 parcels of land to Riverbend Holdings. The purchase price listed was shockingly low, way below market value. Folks, we're talking bargain basement prices. The kind of deal that would make every farmer in the county spit out his coffee. I knew that land. Good land. Productive land.
Valuable land.
No way Grandpa would have sold it for that amount. No chance. And then I saw the signature. I froze. For a moment, I just stared at it. Walt May. At least that's what it claimed. But something felt wrong. Very wrong. Now, most people probably wouldn't have noticed. The signature looked close enough at first glance. Maybe even convincing. But I'd spent more than 20 years looking at Grandpa's handwriting. I knew every loop, every stroke, every habit, the same way you recognize a loved one's voice on the phone. And this wasn't it. The signature was careful. Too careful. Too smooth. Too perfect. Grandpa's writing had changed during his final years. His medications made his hand shake. Not dramatically, but enough. This signature looked steady as a ruler, almost like somebody was trying too hard. I pulled out older records and compared them side by side. The difference jumped out immediately. Grandpa always put a strong downward stroke in the first letter of his name. Always. This one didn't. It was subtle, but it was there. Or rather, it wasn't. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My heart was pounding, because if I was right, this wasn't just a missing will anymore. This was fraud. For several minutes, I just sat there, trying to think, trying not to jump to conclusions, trying not to let emotions outrun evidence. Grandpa taught me better than that. Facts first, feelings second. So I asked myself a simple question. If Riverbend Holdings bought the land, who owned Riverbend Holdings? That answer would tell me a lot. Maybe everything. I grabbed my laptop and opened the state's business registry. Most companies leave footprints. The trick is knowing where to look. I typed in the name, Riverbend Holdings. A record popped up. I clicked it, and suddenly everything got very quiet, because the deeper I followed the paperwork, the closer it seemed to lead back towards someone I already knew. Someone who stood to gain from a missing will. Someone who had access to Grandpa's property. Someone who was acting awfully confident for a man claiming there wasn't anything to hide. My father. I wish I could tell you I was shocked. Truth is, I wasn't. Not completely. Deep down, I'd been heading toward that conclusion for weeks. What shocked me was how bold it all looked. How careless. Like he genuinely believed nobody would ever bother checking. Like he thought the paperwork would stay buried forever.
Boy, was he wrong.
Because once I started pulling on that thread, the whole sweater was about to come apart. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my father suddenly changed tactics. The threats stopped. The legal letters stopped. And out of nowhere, he started acting friendly. Real friendly. But folks, when a man who's been fighting you suddenly starts smiling, you'd better check what's hidden behind his back. Because the document he asked me to sign next could have cost me everything. Have you ever noticed how some people change their tune the minute they realize you're not falling for their story? One day they're threatening you. The next day they're calling you sweetheart. One day they're slamming doors. The next day they're talking about family unity. That's exactly what my father did. The pressure wasn't working. The guilt wasn't working. The lawyer's letters weren't working. So he reached into his bag of tricks and pulled out an old favorite.
Charm.
And let me tell you something. When a man suddenly gets friendly after weeks of fighting, you'd better hold on to your wallet. A few days after I found the suspicious land transfers, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dad. I stared at it for a moment, then answered. His voice was warm, almost cheerful. So cheerful it sounded fake. Hey, kiddo. I nearly dropped the phone. Folks, my father hadn't called me kiddo in years. Not unless he wanted something. Right away, I knew this conversation wasn't about family. It was about business. For the first few minutes, he danced around the subject. Asked how I was doing. Talked about the weather. Asked about work. The whole thing felt like watching a salesman circle a customer. Then he finally got to the point. He said the family was being torn apart. He said Grandpa would hate seeing us fight. He said everybody needed to move forward. And then came the real reason for the call. He wanted me to sign something. A family settlement agreement. Now, folks, that sounds harmless enough. Maybe even reasonable. Until you actually read it. Because buried inside that little agreement was one very important detail. If I signed it, I'd be giving up any future claim related to Grandpa's estate. No questions. No challenges. No objections. Nothing. Just sign the paper and walk away.
Convenient, right?
Especially for somebody trying very hard to keep people from asking questions. As Dad talked, I heard another voice in the background. His wife, Sharon. She'd always been good at influencing conversations without appearing to. A few moments later, she got on the phone herself. And that's when the guilt trip started. "Avery," she said softly. "Think about Cole's baby." There it was. Right on schedule. I could have predicted it word for word. She talked about family.
About peace.
About keeping everyone together. Then she played the card I'd seen used 100 times in probate cases. The child card. You don't want to take food away from a newborn, do you? Folks, when people can't beat your argument, they often attack your conscience. That's exactly what was happening. Because nobody was talking about facts anymore. Nobody was talking about the missing will. Nobody was talking about Riverbend Holdings. They wanted me focused on emotions. And there was a reason for that. Facts weren't on their side. A few years earlier, that strategy might have worked. I loved my family. I wanted peace. I hated conflict. But working around probate cases had taught me something. The loudest emotional arguments usually show up when the paperwork is weak. People with strong evidence don't need manipulation. The documents speak for themselves. My father's documents clearly couldn't.
So I stayed calm.
Very calm. Grandpa used to say, never show your cards too early. For once, I listened. I thanked them for calling. Told them I understood their concerns. Said I'd review everything carefully. Then I promised I'd take a few days before making any decisions. My father sounded relieved. Almost excited. He thought he was winning. He thought I'd finally started backing down. The funny thing about dishonest people is they often mistake patience for weakness. And my father had been making that mistake my entire life. The paperwork arrived the next morning. 1 page. Simple.
Direct.
Dangerous. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Every sentence seemed carefully designed to protect one person.
Dad.
Not Grandpa's wishes. Not the estate.
Not the family. Dad.
I set the document beside the land transfer papers. On one side of my table sat a suspicious deed. On the other sat a settlement agreement begging me not to investigate further. The timing wasn't exactly subtle. The more I looked at everything, the more convinced I became that I was getting close. Too close. Because people don't offer peace when they're winning. They offer peace when they're nervous. And for the first time since Grandpa died, my father looked nervous. Very nervous. That told me something important. The missing will wasn't just a theory anymore. It was becoming a problem. For him. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the attorney's office I'd visited with Grandpa years ago. The will had existed. I knew it. I'd seen him sign it. So where was it now? If the original document had vanished, somebody benefited. And there was only one person benefiting from its disappearance. My father. The question wasn't whether a will existed. The question was where it went. And who made sure nobody would ever find it. The next morning, I grabbed my keys and headed toward the county seat. Because there was one person who might still know the truth. The lawyer who helped Grandpa create the will. Or at least that's what I hoped. What I found instead nearly broke my heart. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, the building was empty. The attorney was dead. The files were gone. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I might actually lose. But that night, a stranger was waiting outside my apartment. And the envelope she carried would change everything. Have you ever chased an answer so long that every door starts slamming shut right before you reach it? That's exactly where I found myself. The will was missing. The land transfers looked crooked. My father was suddenly desperate for me to sign away my rights. And now the one man who could have confirmed everything was gone.
Dead.
His office closed. His files vanished. For the first time since Grandpa's funeral, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel.
Defeat.
And that's usually when life surprises you. Because the night I thought I'd hit a dead end, someone knocked on my door and brought the one thing my father never expected anyone to find. The drive to the county seat wasn't encouraging. The little law office where Grandpa had signed his will 6 years earlier was gone. The sign had been removed. The windows were dusty. The place looked abandoned. I sat in my car staring at the building for several minutes, trying to process it. Finally, I called the number posted on the leasing sign. The realtor answered. That's how I learned attorney Harold Pruitt had passed away 2 years earlier. His practice had closed shortly afterward. As for his files, nobody seemed to know where they went. Some had supposedly been returned to clients. Others transferred elsewhere. Nobody could tell me anything useful. Every trail seemed to end with the same answer. We don't know. I spent the rest of the day making calls. The county records office, the local bar association, former employees, anybody who might know something. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Every lead dried up. Every conversation ended the same way. No records. No file. No copy. No answers. By the time I headed home, darkness had settled across the highway. And for the first time, I honestly wondered if Dad might get away with it. You see, folks, probate law has a frustrating rule. If someone creates a will but the original can't be found after they die, courts often assume the person destroyed it themselves. In other words, if Grandpa's original will stayed missing, the law might simply pretend it never mattered. That thought haunted me all the way home, because I knew Grandpa had made a will. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. But knowing something and proving it are two very different things. And courts care about proof. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I was exhausted. Mentally, emotionally, physically. All I wanted was a cup of coffee and a few hours without thinking about lawyers, wills, or my father. Then I noticed someone standing near my building. A woman. Older. Maybe 70. Maybe a little older. She stood beneath the parking lot light with her hands folded calmly in front of her. Not pacing. Not nervous. Just waiting. Almost like she'd been expecting me. My first instinct was caution. I stayed near my car. She smiled politely. Are you Avery May? The moment she said my name, every alarm bell in my head started ringing. Who's asking? I replied. The woman nodded slowly. Then she said something that stopped me cold. Walt's granddaughter.
She paused.
The one who kept the books. Folks, very few people knew Grandpa used to call me that. The keeper of the books. Suddenly, my exhaustion disappeared. Now I was paying attention. Very close attention. I told her yes. I was Avery. The woman introduced herself as Ruth Howard. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then she explained. For more than 30 years, she'd worked for attorney Harold Pruitt, his secretary, his notary, the gray-haired woman who had witnessed hundreds of legal documents over the years, including one very important will. My grandfather's. I felt my pulse quicken.
Fast.
You're saying you remember it? Ruth nodded. I didn't just remember it. She looked me straight in the eye. I witnessed it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot seemed completely silent. Then Ruth explained why she'd come. She'd seen Grandpa's obituary. Then she'd seen the probate notice in the local paper. The notice claimed Walt May died without a will. And, according to Ruth, that wasn't true. Not even close. For several nights, she'd wrestled with what to do. Something about the situation bothered her. Finally, she decided she couldn't stay quiet. So she'd gone looking for me. Not my father. Not the court.
Me.
The granddaughter, who kept the books. The granddaughter Walt trusted. I invited her inside, made coffee, and together we sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd spent weeks chasing answers. Ruth carefully removed an envelope from her purse. The envelope looked worn. Handled many times. Protected. Important. My hands trembled as she placed it in front of me. You need to see this, she said. I stared at it for several seconds. Because somehow I knew everything was about to change. Slowly, I opened the envelope. 3 items slid onto the table. The first one stole the air right out of my lungs. A photocopy. A complete photocopy. Of Walt May's last will and testament. Folks, when I started reading that will, my entire world changed. Because Grandpa hadn't left everything to my father. Not even close. In fact, his actual wishes were the exact opposite of what Dad had been telling everyone. And the second item inside that envelope? It was proof that the will had really been signed. But proving it existed was only half the battle. Now I had to prove who made the original disappear. I'll never forget that moment. There I was, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a photocopy of my grandfather's will. For weeks, people had treated me like I was chasing a ghost. Dad said there was no will. His lawyer acted like I was imagining things. Half the family thought I was stirring up trouble. And now, the proof was sitting right in front of me. But here's the thing. Finding the will wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Because proving a will existed and proving it belongs in court are two very different things. And my father still had one huge advantage. The original was gone. I picked up the document with both hands. My eyes raced across every page, every signature, every paragraph, every word. The further I read, the harder it became to breathe. Because Grandpa's wishes were crystal clear. There was no confusion, no gray area, no mystery. The store and family home weren't supposed to go to Dad. They were meant for Cole and me, together. Exactly the opposite of what Dad had been telling everyone. Now, before anybody thinks Grandpa cut Dad out completely, that's not what happened. Dad wasn't disinherited. Not at all. Grandpa left him a fair share. A generous share, honestly. But he didn't leave him control. He didn't leave him everything. And that's the part that mattered. Because my father hadn't just been stretching the truth. He'd been building an entire story around a lie. For a few minutes, I couldn't even speak. I just sat there staring at the pages. Not because of the money. Not because of the land. Because of what it meant. Grandpa trusted me.
He believed in me.
Even after all those years of being overlooked by my father, talked over by relatives, and treated like the quiet one, Grandpa saw me. He saw the work. He saw the loyalty. He saw everything. And he'd written it down. Officially. Legally. Forever. Ruth watched me carefully from across the table. Then she slid the second item toward me. A photocopy from her notary journal. Folks, if you've never seen a notary journal, it's basically a permanent record.
Date.
Document. Signature. Witness. Everything gets logged. And right there on the page was the entry.
The date.
The will. My grandfather's name. Ruth's signature. Her seal. The record was real. And unlike memories, records don't get fuzzy with age. Then she handed me the third item. A worn index card. On it was a name and an old phone number. Earl Dabney. I looked at her. Who's Earl? She smiled. The second witness. Suddenly my brain kicked back into work mode. One witness was good. Two witnesses were better. Much better. Because if Ruth and Earl both confirmed the signing, it would strengthen everything. The existence of the will. Its contents. The circumstances surrounding it. All of it. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since Grandpa died. Hope. Real hope. But Ruth wasn't finished. She took a sip of coffee and looked directly at me. The expression on her face turned serious. Avery, she said gently, a copy isn't the same thing as the original. My excitement cooled immediately, because I already knew where she was going. She explained it exactly the way a court would. The copy proved the will existed. The notary journal helped prove it was signed properly. The witness could verify what happened. All of that was valuable. But there was still a problem. A big one. The law would assume Grandpa destroyed the original himself, unless I could prove otherwise. In other words, I needed more than evidence. I needed a story supported by facts. A story that explained how the original disappeared. And, more importantly, who benefited from it disappearing. After Ruth left, I stayed awake most of the night. The coffee pot never got a chance to cool down. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started organizing everything. Just like Grandpa used to do. Column by column. Fact by fact.
Question by question.
At the top of the page I wrote 3 names.
Ruth.
Earl.
Dale.
Then I started making notes. Ruth could prove the will was signed. Earl could help confirm it. Dad had motive. The forged land transfer suggested fraud. Riverbend Holdings pointed back toward him. The missing will benefited him more than anyone else. The pieces were starting to fit. But one piece was still missing. The biggest piece of all. Access. I needed proof that Dad had the opportunity to make the original will disappear. Without that, the case could still fall apart. As dawn approached, I looked down at the page. The list was growing. The evidence was growing. The truth was growing. And for the first time since Grandpa's funeral, I realized something important. Dad wasn't ahead anymore. Not really.
He just didn't know it yet.
The very next morning, I started searching for the second witness. Finding him wouldn't be easy. The phone number was dead. The trail was cold. And the man I needed was over 80 years old. But when I finally tracked him down, he revealed something Grandpa said 6 years earlier that nearly brought me to tears. And at the same time, my father was preparing a brand new attack. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the people everyone else forgets about. The quiet ones. The loyal ones. The folks who don't spend their lives chasing attention. Because while my father was busy hiring lawyers and spinning stories, I was looking for an 81-year-old man named Earl Dabney. And what he remembered would change everything. The phone number Ruth gave me was disconnected. No surprise there. The man was in his 80s. Most people his age weren't updating contact information online. So I started asking around.
The old-fashioned way.
I called feed suppliers, former store customers, retired farmers, folks who'd known Grandpa for decades. In a small town, information travels differently. You don't find it on the internet. You find it at diners, hardware stores, and church parking lots. 3 days later, an old customer finally pointed me in the right direction. Earl was living on a small property outside town with his granddaughter. Still independent. Still sharp. Still stubborn. Just the way Grandpa would have liked him. When I pulled into his driveway, I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe confusion. Maybe a failing memory. Maybe a polite conversation that led nowhere. Instead, I found Earl sitting on a porch swing drinking coffee. And before I even introduced myself, he smiled. "You look just like Walt." Folks, that nearly got me right there. We talked for almost 2 hours. About Grandpa. About the store. About the old days. Then, eventually, I asked the question that brought me there. "Do you remember witnessing Grandpa's will?" Earl didn't hesitate. Not for a second. "Sure do."
Just like that.
No uncertainty. No guessing. No struggling to remember. He remembered. Then Earl told me the story. 6 years earlier, Grandpa had asked him to stop by Attorney Pruitt's office. Said he needed a witness for some paperwork. Nothing unusual. Folks in small towns do things like that all the time. Earl showed up. Ruth was there. Attorney Pruitt was there.
And so was Grandpa.
They signed the documents. Witnessed the signatures. Then afterward, Grandpa insisted on buying everyone lunch. That part made me smile. That sounded exactly like Walt May. But then Earl said something that hit me right in the heart. Something he'd never forgotten. He leaned back in his chair and pointed toward me. "The old man was proud of you." I swallowed hard. "How do you know?" Earl chuckled. "Because he wouldn't shut up about it." According to Earl, lunch that day turned into an hour-long conversation. Grandpa talked about the business, the land, the future. And somewhere in the middle of it, he'd pointed toward the parking lot.
Toward my car.
Because I'd driven him there that day. Then he'd smiled. And said words Earl never forgot. "Avery keeps the real books." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I just sat there trying to process it. Because folks, when someone you love is gone, little things matter. Words matter. Memories matter. And hearing that from Earl felt like hearing Grandpa's voice one more time. Then Earl got serious. Very serious. He leaned forward. "Avery, your granddad knew exactly what he was doing." I nodded. "I know." "No," Earl said firmly. "I mean he knew." The emphasis caught my attention. Then Earl explained. Grandpa had talked openly that day about wanting fairness. Not favoritism. Not punishment. Fairness. He wanted the business protected. He wanted the family home preserved. And he wanted both grandchildren involved. That was his plan. His actual plan. not the story Dad was selling. By the time I left Earl's property, I had exactly what I needed. A second witness. A credible witness. A witness who remembered the signing clearly. And more importantly, a witness willing to testify. The case was getting stronger. Much stronger. Which meant Dad's position was getting weaker. Much weaker. Unfortunately, my father wasn't sitting around waiting for the truth to catch him. He was making moves too. Big ones. Because while I was tracking down witnesses, Dad was quietly trying to sell more estate property. And when I discovered what he was doing, I realized time was running out.
Fast.
That evening I checked newly filed county records. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then one document stopped me cold. A pending transaction involving estate assets. Assets Dad wasn't supposed to be touching. At least not that way. Not yet. Not while questions remained unanswered. Not while ownership was being disputed. My pulse started racing. Because if that deal went through, undoing the damage could take years. Maybe longer. For the first time since finding the will copy, I felt genuine panic. Not fear for myself. Fear for Grandpa's legacy. Because every day Dad stayed in control was another day he could move money, transfer assets, and create more problems. And suddenly I understood something. This wasn't just about proving the truth anymore. It was about stopping him before more disappeared. The next morning, I walked into an attorney's office carrying Ruth's records, Earl's statement, and the copy of Grandpa's will. Within an hour, a legal petition was being drafted. And when my father received notice of what we were filing, he completely lost his cool. But his biggest mistake was still ahead of him. Because hidden deep inside the family home was one piece of evidence he never thought anyone would find. If you've ever watched somebody dig themselves into a hole, you know there's a moment when they should stop digging. A moment when common sense ought to kick in. A moment when they should throw down the shovel and walk away. My father missed that moment entirely. Because after receiving notice that we were challenging the estate proceedings, he didn't back off. He doubled down. And that's when the cracks started showing. Big cracks. The kind that eventually bring the whole house down. The attorney I hired moved fast. Faster than Dad expected. Within days, we filed a petition asking the court to recognize the copy of Grandpa's will and investigate the circumstances surrounding the missing original. The filing included Ruth's statement, Earl's statement, the notary records, and evidence raising serious questions about Dad's management of the estate. For the first time since Grandpa's death, someone with legal authority was asking questions. Questions Dad couldn't easily ignore. The reaction came almost immediately. My phone started ringing. Relatives started calling. Family friends started reaching out. Apparently, Dad was telling everyone that I was trying to bankrupt the family. According to him, I was greedy, vindictive,
Selfish.
He claimed I was dragging everybody through court because I couldn't accept Grandpa's death. Folks, when facts aren't working, some people switch to character attacks. And my father had become an expert at it. The funny thing was, the more he talked, the more nervous he sounded. The confident man from the funeral was disappearing. In his place was somebody scrambling. Somebody worried. Somebody losing control. And people were starting to notice. Even relatives who normally stayed out of family drama were beginning to ask questions.
Questions Dad didn't like.
Then something unexpected happened.
Cole called me.
His voice sounded tense. "Have you talked to Dad today?" I hadn't. Why? There was a pause. A long one. Then Cole sighed. He went to the house. My stomach tightened. What house? Grandpa's. Now folks, that immediately set off alarms. The family home was still part of the estate. Everything inside mattered. Documents mattered. Records mattered. Potential evidence mattered. And suddenly Dad was making unscheduled visits. That wasn't good. Not good at all. According to Cole, Dad had spent nearly 6 hours inside the house. Alone. No explanation. No reason given. Just 6 hours behind locked doors. When he finally left, he'd loaded several boxes into his truck. Then driven away. Nobody knew where the boxes went. Nobody knew what was inside them. And Dad wasn't talking. That evening, I drove past the property myself. I didn't go inside. Not yet. I simply sat across the road, looking at the place. The porch.
The barn.
The old oak tree Grandpa planted years ago. Everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Something felt wrong. Like somebody had disturbed more than furniture. Like somebody was searching for something. Or hiding something. The next morning, my attorney helped secure an emergency court order preventing additional transfers or sales involving estate assets until the dispute was resolved. That was a major win. A very major win. Because it meant Dad couldn't keep moving pieces around the board. At least not legally. But the real breakthrough came a few days later. And it came from a source nobody expected. An old maintenance receipt. Folks, Grandpa used to save everything. Receipts. Invoices. Repair records. If somebody changed a light bulb, there was probably paperwork for it somewhere. That habit was about to save us. While reviewing old files, I found a reference to the floor safe inside Grandpa's home office. A heavy steel safe built into the floor beneath a rug. I remembered it immediately. Grandpa stored important papers there. Property records. Insurance documents. Business contracts. Things he didn't want lying around. The discovery got my attention. Because if Grandpa had an original will, the safe would have been one of the first places he'd keep it. I asked Cole about it. His answer made my blood run cold. The safe had been locked after Grandpa's death. Nobody could open it. At least that's what Dad claimed. Then Cole mentioned something else. Something he almost forgot. A locksmith had come to the house shortly after the funeral. Very shortly after. I sat straight up in my chair. A locksmith? Yeah, Cole said. Dad said the lock was giving him trouble. Folks, right then, I knew we were onto something. Because people don't usually hire locksmiths to access empty safes. And they definitely don't replace locks on safes that supposedly contain nothing important. For the next several hours, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The missing will. The changed lock. The boxes removed from the house. Dad's sudden panic. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it painted a very interesting picture. A picture the court might want to see. And then my attorney found the document that connected everything. A work order. An actual locksmith work order. With a date. A signature. And one very important name written right across the top. Dale May. Folks, that locksmith receipt would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. Because it showed something my father desperately wanted hidden. He had exclusive access to Grandpa's safe after the funeral. And once the judge saw what was inside that work order, the entire case started turning against him. But Dad still had one last card to play. And he was about to use it in open court. There comes a point in every lie when keeping the story straight becomes harder than telling the truth. My father had reached that point. The missing will. The suspicious land transfers. The witness statements. The locksmith receipt. Piece by piece, the walls were closing in. And now, for the first time since Grandpa died, he would have to answer questions in front of a judge. Not family. Not neighbors. Not people he could intimidate. A judge. And, trust me, he wasn't nearly as comfortable there. The first hearing wasn't dramatic like television makes it look. No surprise confessions. No shouting matches. Just lawyers, paperwork, and a courtroom full of people paying close attention. But folks, sometimes the quiet moments are the ones that matter most. Because that's where the truth starts taking shape. I sat beside my attorney, while Dad sat across the room with Garrett Voss. The same lawyer who'd spent weeks trying to scare me into backing down. Neither one looked particularly happy to see us. Especially after reading the evidence we'd submitted. The copy of the will. Ruth's statement. Earl's statement. The notary records. And most importantly, the locksmith work order. Judge Hollis reviewed the filings carefully. Then she started asking questions. Simple questions. Reasonable questions. Questions that should have had simple answers. When did the original will disappear? Who had access to the house? Who had access to the safe? Who controlled the estate property after Walt May's death? Every answer pointed in the same direction. My father. Voss tried to argue that none of it proved wrongdoing. Maybe the will had been destroyed. Maybe Grandpa changed his mind. Maybe the copy was outdated. Maybe everybody's memory was wrong. Folks, lawyers get paid to create doubt. That's their job. The problem was every argument seemed to create a new question. And the judge noticed. Then my attorney introduced the locksmith receipt. The courtroom became very quiet. The document showed that 11 days after Grandpa's funeral, Dad hired a locksmith to drill and replace the lock on the floor safe. Not inspect it, not repair it, replace it.
Completely.
And the customer listed on the work order? Dale May. Judge Hollis looked directly at Dad. Why was the safe opened? Dad shifted in his chair. For the first time all morning, he looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. He claimed he was simply securing estate property. A routine precaution. Nothing unusual. But the explanation felt thin, even from where I was sitting. Then the judge asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What was inside the safe? Folks, that question hit the room like a thunderclap, because suddenly everybody realized the same thing. If the will had been stored there, and Dad was the only person with access afterward, that changed everything. Dad hesitated. Just for a moment. But it was enough. People notice hesitation. Especially judges. Finally, he claimed he couldn't remember exactly what was inside. Couldn't remember. The man who supposedly spent 6 hours sorting through Grandpa's belongings couldn't remember what came out of the safe. That answer landed about as well as you'd expect. I glanced toward Cole. His expression said it all. Even he wasn't buying it anymore. And that mattered. Because Cole had spent weeks trying to give Dad the benefit of the doubt. Weeks trying to believe there was some innocent explanation. Now that faith was cracking.
Fast.
The hearing ended without a final ruling. But the judge made one thing very clear. The case wasn't going away. In fact, she scheduled a full evidentiary hearing. Witness testimony. Document review.
The whole thing.
This wasn't just a paperwork dispute anymore. It was becoming a real courtroom battle. And for the first time, my father looked genuinely worried. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. Television cameras weren't rolling. Life carried on normally. But inside our family, everything had changed. The story Dad spent weeks telling was falling apart. And everybody knew it, including him. That evening, Cole called me. His voice sounded different.
Heavier.
More serious. I think Dad's lying. Folks, hearing that hurt more than I expected. Because nobody wants to believe that about their own parent. Nobody. But sometimes the evidence gets too loud to ignore. Then Cole told me something that made my pulse jump. A memory. A small detail he'd never thought mattered before. A conversation he'd overheard between Dad and Grandpa months before Grandpa died. At the time it seemed meaningless. Now, it sounded like a warning. According to Cole, Grandpa and Dad had argued about the future of the store. And during that argument, Grandpa said something chilling. Something that suddenly explained everything. Because months before he died, Grandpa already knew exactly what Dad might try to do. And what Cole remembered would become one of the most powerful moments in the entire courtroom battle. One thing I've learned about family secrets is this. They rarely appear out of nowhere. Most of the time, the warning signs were there all along. People just didn't recognize them until later. That's exactly what happened with my grandfather. Because months before he died, he saw something in my father that the rest of us either missed or refused to believe. And when Cole finally remembered that conversation, it felt like somebody had turned on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, everything started making sense. A few days after the hearing, Cole came by my apartment again. This time, he wasn't carrying excuses. He wasn't carrying Dad's talking points. He wasn't trying to play peacemaker. He looked like a man wrestling with a hard truth. The truth about his own father. And folks, that's a heavy burden. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where this whole investigation seemed to live now. Coffee between us. Paperwork spread everywhere. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Cole finally broke the silence. I remembered something. I looked up. His expression told me immediately it mattered. A lot. According to Cole, about 8 months before Grandpa died, there'd been a heated argument at the feed store. Not unusual. Dad and Grandpa had been butting heads for years. But this one was different. This one got personal. Very personal. Cole had been unloading supplies in the back warehouse when voices started carrying through the open door. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The conversation was simply impossible to ignore. Dad was angry, really angry, talking about the future of the business, the land, ownership, control. The same subjects now sitting at the center of our court case. Apparently, Dad believed the store should automatically become his. The house, too. The farmland. Everything. In his mind, being Walt May's son entitled him to it. End of discussion. Grandpa disagreed. Strongly. Cole remembered hearing Dad say something like, "I've spent my whole life here." Then Grandpa answered.
Calmly, firmly.
The way he always did when he meant every word. "Being my son doesn't make you the right man for the job." Folks, that sentence hit me hard, because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. He respected effort, responsibility, character, not titles, not entitlement, and certainly not family politics. Then came the part Cole never forgot, the part that had stayed buried in his memory until now. Dad accused Grandpa of choosing me over him, the same complaint he'd been carrying for years, maybe decades. And Grandpa's answer stopped the argument cold. He didn't choose Avery because she's family. Cole looked directly at me. Grandpa said he chose you because he trusted you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Neither could Cole.
Trust. That was the whole story right there.
Not money.
Not land.
Not inheritance.
Trust.
Grandpa trusted me with the books. Trusted me with records. Trusted me with responsibility. And apparently, that trust had bothered my father for years. Then Cole told me the final part of the conversation. The part that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. As Dad stormed toward the door, Grandpa called after him. One final sentence. One final warning. If anything happens to that will, I'll know exactly who did it. The room went silent. Folks, when Cole said those words, I felt a chill run through me. Because suddenly, the missing will didn't look like an accident anymore. It looked like something Grandpa himself feared might happen. Now, was that statement legal proof?
No.
Of course not. The court wouldn't decide the case based on a family argument. But it helped explain motive. It explained tension. It explained years of resentment that finally boiled over after Grandpa died. And motive matters, especially when evidence keeps piling up. As the evidentiary hearing approached, our case kept getting stronger. Witnesses were lined up.
Documents were organized.
Timelines were prepared. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The will existed. The original disappeared. And the person who benefited most from that disappearance was my father. Meanwhile, Dad seemed to be unraveling. Relatives who once supported him were getting quiet. Some stopped returning his calls. Others started asking uncomfortable questions. The confidence he'd shown after the funeral was fading fast. Because deep down, I think he knew what was coming. The truth. And the truth was heading straight toward a courtroom. Then, 2 nights before the hearing, my attorney called. His voice sounded excited. Very excited.
He'd found something.
Something we hadn't even known existed. A document hidden inside old business records. A document that connected my father directly to Riverbend Holdings. And folks, it was about to blow a hole in his entire defense. The next morning, I opened a file that should never have existed. Inside was proof that Riverbend Holdings wasn't some random company. It was connected to my father from the very beginning. And once the judge saw it, Dad's story would start collapsing faster than he could invent new lies. One thing I've learned about family secrets is this. They rarely appear out of nowhere. Most of the time, the warning signs were there all along. People just didn't recognize them until later. That's exactly what happened with my grandfather. Because months before he died, he saw something in my father that the rest of us either missed or refused to believe. And when Cole finally remembered that conversation, it felt like somebody had turned on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, everything started making sense. A few days after the hearing, Cole came by my apartment again. This time, he wasn't carrying excuses. He wasn't carrying Dad's talking points. He wasn't trying to play peacemaker. He looked like a man wrestling with a hard truth. The truth about his own father. And folks, that's a heavy burden. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where this whole investigation seemed to live now. Coffee between us. Paperwork spread everywhere. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Cole finally broke the silence. I remembered something. I looked up. His expression told me immediately it mattered. A lot. According to Cole, about 8 months before Grandpa died, there'd been a heated argument at the feed store. Not unusual. Dad and Grandpa had been butting heads for years. But this one was different. This one got personal. Very personal. Cole had been unloading supplies in the back warehouse when voices started carrying through the open door. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The conversation was simply impossible to ignore. Dad was angry. Really angry. Talking about the future of the business. The land. Ownership. Control. The same subjects now sitting at the center of our court case. Apparently, Dad believed the store should automatically become his. The house, too. The farmland. Everything. In his mind, being Walt May's son entitled him to it. End of discussion. Grandpa disagreed. Strongly. Cole remembered hearing Dad say something like, "I've spent my whole life here." Then Grandpa answered. Calmly. Firmly. The way he always did when he meant every word. "Being my son doesn't make you the right man for the job." Folks, that sentence hit me hard. Because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. He respected effort, responsibility, character, not titles, not entitlement, and certainly not family politics. Then came the part Cole never forgot, the part that had stayed buried in his memory until now. Dad accused Grandpa of choosing me over him, the same complaint he'd been carrying for years, maybe decades. And Grandpa's answer stopped the argument cold. He didn't choose Avery because she's family. Cole looked directly at me. Grandpa said he chose you because he trusted you. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Neither could Cole. Trust. That was the whole story, right there. Not money. Not land. Not inheritance. Trust. Grandpa trusted me with the books. Trusted me with records. Trusted me with responsibility. And apparently, that trust had bothered my father for years. Then Cole told me the final part of the conversation. The part that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. As Dad stormed toward the door, Grandpa called after him. One final sentence. One final warning. If anything happens to that will, I'll know exactly who did it. The room went silent. Folks, when Cole said those words, I felt a chill run through me. Because suddenly, the missing will didn't look like an accident anymore. It looked like something Grandpa himself feared might happen. Now, was that statement legal proof? No. Of course not. The court wouldn't decide the case based on a family argument. But it helped explain motive. It explained tension. It explained years of resentment that finally boiled over after Grandpa died. And motive matters, especially when evidence keeps piling up. As the evidentiary hearing approached, our case kept getting stronger. Witnesses were lined up. Documents were organized. Timelines were prepared. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The will existed. The original disappeared. And the person who benefited most from that disappearance was my father. Meanwhile, Dad seemed to be unraveling. Relatives who once supported him were getting quiet. Some stopped returning his calls. Others started asking uncomfortable questions. The confidence he'd shown after the funeral was fading fast. Because deep down, I think he knew what was coming. The truth. And the truth was heading straight toward a courtroom. Then, 2 nights before the hearing, my attorney called. His voice sounded excited. Very excited. He'd found something. Something we hadn't even known existed. A document hidden inside old business records. A document that connected my father directly to Riverbend Holdings. And folks, it was about to blow a hole in his entire defense. The next morning, I opened a file that should never have existed. Inside was proof that Riverbend Holdings wasn't some random company. It was connected to my father from the very beginning. And once the judge saw it, Dad's story would start collapsing faster than he could invent new lies. There's an old saying where I come from. Follow the money. Because money has a funny habit. People lie. People forget. People change their stories. But money? Money leaves tracks. And once we started following those tracks, my father's entire story began falling apart. Not a little, not slowly.
Completely.
2 days before the evidentiary hearing, my attorney called. The excitement in his voice was impossible to miss. "Avery," he said, "I think we got him." Now, folks, lawyers aren't known for getting excited. Most of them get more emotional over a stapler than a major breakthrough. So when my attorney sounded energized, I knew this was serious. Very serious. I drove straight to his office. The moment I walked in, he slid a folder across the desk. Inside were corporate registration records connected to Riverbend Holdings, the same company that somehow purchased Grandpa's land for a fraction of its value. The same company I'd never heard of before all this started. The same company Dad insisted had nothing to do with him. Well, that dog wasn't going to hunt anymore. Because buried in those records was the truth. Riverbend Holdings had been created almost 2 years before Grandpa died. And one of the original filing addresses connected directly back to a property owned by my father. Not a neighbor. Not a friend. My father. Then it got worse. Much worse. A review of banking records showed payments moving between estate-related accounts and Riverbend Holdings. The amounts weren't enormous individually, but together, they painted an ugly picture. A very ugly picture. Folks, this wasn't just a questionable land sale anymore. This was beginning to look like a pattern. A pattern of moving assets. A pattern of benefiting personally from estate property. A pattern the court was definitely going to want explained. The more we organized the records, the stronger the timeline became. First, Grandpa creates a valid will. Then Grandpa dies. Then Dad gains exclusive control over the house. Then the safe lock gets replaced. Then the original will disappears. Then land gets transferred through a company linked to Dad. Then estate funds start showing unusual activity.
Piece by piece.
Step by step. The story practically assembled itself. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous.
Because I was thinking about Grandpa.
I kept remembering all those afternoons at the store. The brass bell ringing over the door. The smell of grain dust. His coffee cup sitting beside the ledger. And one lesson he'd repeated 1,000 times. The books don't lie. At the time, it sounded like bookkeeping advice. Now it sounded like prophecy. The next morning, the courtroom filled quickly. More people showed up than I expected. Family members, neighbors, former customers, folks who'd known Grandpa for years. Word had spread through town. People wanted answers. Dad arrived with Garrett Voss. Both looked tired. Much more tired than before. The confidence they'd shown early in the case was mostly gone. And honestly, I think they knew what was coming. The hearing started with documents. Lots of documents. Our attorney methodically walked through each piece of evidence. The will copy, the notary records, the witness statements, the locksmith receipt, the land transfers, the Riverbend Holdings filings, the accounting records, one after another, like bricks building a wall. And every brick pointed toward the same conclusion. Then came one of the most powerful moments of the entire case. The accounting records. Folks, accounting isn't exciting. Nobody makes movies about spreadsheets. But those records hit harder than any dramatic speech ever could. Because numbers don't get emotional. Numbers don't exaggerate. Numbers simply tell the truth. Page by page, transaction by transaction, the court reviewed the records. Inflated fees, questionable expenses, legal bills charged back to the estate. Payments benefiting people who shouldn't have been benefiting. The deeper we went, the quieter the courtroom became. Even people in the gallery stopped shifting in their seats. They were listening. Really listening. Then Judge Hollis asked a question that seemed simple, but it landed like a hammer. She looked directly at Dad. Can you explain why estate assets repeatedly benefited a company connected to you? Folks, for the first time all day, my father had no answer. Not a real one.
He tried.
Of course he tried. Talked about misunderstandings, business necessities, accounting errors, confusion, anything he could think of. But every explanation created new problems. Every answer opened another hole. And everyone in that courtroom could see it happening. Then Judge Hollis announced that witness testimony would begin. And that's when things got truly dangerous for my father. Because documents are powerful, but people tell stories. And the first witness waiting outside that courtroom door was Ruth Howaren, the woman who watched my grandfather sign his will. As Ruth walked toward the witness stand, my father stopped looking angry. He started looking scared. Because Ruth wasn't bringing opinions. She wasn't bringing guesses. She was bringing first-hand testimony. And after her came Earl, the man who remembered exactly what Grandpa said the day that will was signed. What happened next would completely change the direction of the case and push my father closer to a mistake he could never take back. There are moments in a courtroom when you can actually feel the balance shift. Nobody says it out loud. Nobody announces it. But suddenly everybody realizes the truth is winning. That's what happened the moment Ruth Howaren took the witness stand. Because up until then, my father's defense had one lifeline left. Maybe the will never existed. Maybe people remembered things wrong. Maybe everybody was confused. Well, Ruth was about to put those excuses in the ground. Ruth walked slowly to the witness stand. Gray hair. Calm expression. Not the kind of person who looked like she enjoyed attention. Honestly, she reminded me a lot of Grandpa. Quiet. Steady. Reliable. The kind of person whose word actually meant something. After being sworn in, she told the court about her years working for attorney Harold Pruitt. More than 3 decades. Thousands of legal documents. Hundreds of wills. And one of those wills belonged to Walt May, my grandfather. She described the day clearly. The office. The conference room. The signatures. The witnesses. Everything. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exaggerated. Just facts. The kind of testimony judges love because it doesn't sound rehearsed. It sounds true because it is. Then my attorney presented the photocopy of the will. Ruth immediately recognized it. She identified the signatures, the formatting, the notarization, and finally, the journal entry she'd kept all those years. Folks, the courtroom got real quiet. Because suddenly this wasn't about family memories anymore. This was professional documentation. Permanent documentation. Garrett Voss tried his best. He questioned her memory. Asked how she could remember one will among hundreds. Maybe thousands. Ruth didn't get flustered. Didn't get defensive. She simply smiled. Then she explained. Walt May wasn't memorable because of the will. She glanced toward me. He was memorable because of how proud he was of his granddaughter. Folks, I won't lie. That one almost got me. Ruth explained how Grandpa talked about me that day. About the books. The business. The future. About wanting things done fairly. About wanting his wishes respected. The courtroom listened carefully. Even Voss stopped interrupting. Because there wasn't much he could do with honest testimony. Then came Earl. And folks, Earl was something else. The old farmer shuffled to the witness stand wearing his best jacket and a tie that looked older than I was. When he sat down, he looked completely relaxed, like he was about to discuss the weather, not testify in a major probate dispute. My attorney asked if he remembered witnessing Walt May's will. Earl chuckled. Sure do.
Just like that.
Simple. Certain. No hesitation. Then Earl told the story. The signing. The lunch afterward. The conversations. The things Grandpa said. Everything matched Ruth's testimony. Not perfectly. Nobody's memory works like that. But the important details lined up exactly. And that's what mattered. Then my attorney asked if anything from that day stood out. Anything memorable. Anything he never forgot. Folks, I'll never forget what happened next. Earl looked toward the gallery. Then pointed out the courtroom window. A parking lot sat outside. The cars scattered across it. Nothing special. Then he smiled. My granddaughter's waiting out there. The courtroom looked confused. Even the judge. Then Earl continued. That reminds me of what Walt said. He pointed toward the parking lot again. Only back then, he was pointing at Avery. My throat tightened immediately. Because I already knew what was coming. Earl smiled softly. Walt said, Avery keeps the real books. The courtroom became silent. The kind of silence that settles deep. The kind people remember. Then Earl added something he'd never forgotten. He said it was one of the things he was proudest of. Folks, after everything that happened, every fight, every hearing, every sleepless night, that might have been the hardest moment of all, because for just a second it felt like Grandpa was in the room. Then came the cross-examination. Voss tried attacking Earl's memory, mentioned his age, suggested he might be mistaken. Bad move. Very bad move. Earl leaned forward. I'm 81. Then he shrugged. I'm old, not dead. The gallery laughed. Even Judge Hollis fought back a smile. Then Earl delivered the line nobody forgot. I've spent my life keeping two things.
He paused.
My word and Walt May's trust. Another pause. I'm here because of both. Folks, that landed harder than any lawyer's argument all day. By the time Earl stepped down, the case looked stronger than ever. The will's existence had been confirmed. The signing had been confirmed. The witnesses had been confirmed. The story was holding together,
Solid as bedrock.
which meant only one major question remained. If the will existed, what happened to the original? And everyone in that courtroom already knew where that question was headed. Straight toward my father. Then my attorney stood and announced the next witness.
Me.
And folks, what happened when I took the stand would change everything. Because unlike the others, I wasn't bringing memories. I was bringing records. And records have a way of making liars very uncomfortable. As I walked toward the witness stand, my father wouldn't look at me. Not once. Because sitting inside my folder was the locksmith receipt, the Riverbend records, the accounting trail, and one final piece of evidence he'd completely forgotten about. And when the judge saw it, my father's entire story started collapsing in real time. All my life people underestimated me. Not because I wasn't capable, not because I wasn't smart, but because I was quiet. While other people talked, I listened. While other people argued, I worked. And while other people chased attention, I kept the books. Well, that quiet little habit was about to become my father's worst nightmare. Because when I took the witness stand, I wasn't bringing emotions. I wasn't bringing opinions. I was bringing receipts. And receipts don't care who gets embarrassed. I walked to the witness stand carrying a thin folder. Not a box. Not a stack of binders. Just one folder. Because the strongest evidence rarely needs a lot of decoration. The truth can usually travel light. After being sworn in, my attorney started with simple questions. My role in the business. My relationship with Grandpa. My years keeping records for May Brothers Feed and Grain. Nothing dramatic. Just establishing facts. The foundation. And folks, foundations matter. Because without one, even the biggest house eventually falls. Then we got to the documents. One by one. Slowly. Methodically. The way Grandpa taught me. Never rush the numbers. Let them tell their own story. The first document was the locksmith work order. Projected onto a screen where everyone could see it.
Date.
Service description. Customer name. Everything clear as day. I explained how Grandpa kept important records in the floor safe. Property records. Insurance policies. Business agreements. The kinds of documents people protect. The kinds of documents people don't accidentally throw away. Then I pointed out something important. The lock wasn't repaired. It was drilled and replaced. 11 days after Grandpa's funeral. While Dad had exclusive control of the property, the courtroom stayed silent. Nobody needed help understanding the implication. Next came the Riverbend Holdings documents. The company connected to the suspicious land transfers. The company Dad claimed wasn't really connected to him. The company that somehow ended up benefiting from estate property. Page by page, we walked through the records. Addresses. Ownership information. Transaction histories. The timeline. Everything. And every road seemed to lead back to one person. Dale May. My father. Then came the accounting records. Folks, this was where the room changed. You could feel it. I read entries calmly. No anger. No accusations. Just numbers.
Dates.
Amounts.
Facts.
Inflated administrative fees. Questionable legal expenses. Estate money paying for things that benefited Dad. Not Grandpa's wishes. Not the estate.
Dad.
One transaction at a time. One page at a time. The picture became impossible to ignore. Because when dozens of mistakes all help the same person, folks, they stop looking like mistakes. I looked neither excited nor emotional. I simply kept reading. And the quieter I remained, the louder the evidence became. Then my attorney handed me the final exhibit. The document we'd discovered just days earlier. The one tying everything together. The one my father apparently forgot existed. A property transfer record. Signed during Grandpa's declining health. Containing the signature I'd compared against dozens of authentic examples. The signature that didn't match. I explained exactly why. The missing stroke. The unusual pen pressure. The differences visible across multiple samples. I wasn't presenting myself as a handwriting expert. Just someone who'd spent decades looking at Walt May's writing. Every day. For years. Then my attorney asked the question. The one the entire courtroom had been building toward. Avery, based on all the records you've reviewed, what conclusion did you reach? The room became perfectly still. I looked down at the green ledger sitting beside the evidence table. Grandpa's ledger. The same one he'd trusted me with when I was a kid. The same one that taught me numbers tell the truth. Then I looked directly at my father. For the first time all day. And I spoke calmly. Very calmly. You taught me something years ago, I said. The books don't lie. I paused. People do. Folks, you could have heard a pin drop. Then I gently placed the ledger on the rail in front of me. This is the page you forgot to change. For one long second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Then something happened. Something nobody expected. Least of all my father. He stood up. Fast. Too fast. His chair nearly tipped over. Voss immediately grabbed his arm. Tried to calm him down. Tried to stop whatever was coming. But it was too late. Way too late. Because after weeks of pressure, months of lies, and years of resentment, Dale May finally lost control.
He pointed toward me.
His face red. Voice rising. She's twisting everything, he shouted. She's always thought she was better than this family. Judge Hollis immediately ordered him to sit down. He didn't. Instead, he got louder. Much louder. And folks, the next words out of his mouth would become the biggest mistake of his entire life. My father was angry. Angrier than I'd ever seen him. And when angry people stop thinking, they start telling the truth. Because standing in front of a courtroom full of witnesses, my father was about to say something that destroyed his entire defense. And once those words left his mouth, there was no taking them back. Have you ever watched somebody spend months building a story, only to destroy it in 30 seconds? That's exactly what happened to my father. After all the legal filings, all the excuses, all the accusations, all the blame, the person who finally blew up his defense wasn't me. It wasn't my attorney. It wasn't Ruth. It wasn't Earl. It was Dale May himself. And once he started talking, the truth came pouring out. My father stood in the middle of that courtroom breathing hard.
His face was red.
His hands were shaking. Judge Hollis ordered him to sit down. Again. And again. He ignored her. Voss looked like a man watching a train leave the tracks. Because he knew exactly what was happening. A lawyer can defend bad facts. A lawyer can argue weak evidence. What a lawyer can't fix is a client who won't stop talking. Dad pointed across the courtroom toward me. His voice climbed even higher. That land should have been mine, he shouted. I worked for that store my whole life. Nobody said a word. The courtroom listened. And my father kept digging. The old man never should have put her ahead of me. He yelled. She was just a girl with a ledger. Folks, the moment those words left his mouth, you could almost feel the case ending. Because for months Dad's entire defense had rested on one claim.
The will didn't exist.
That was his story. That was his position. That was the foundation of everything. Then he made the mistake. The one mistake nobody could save him from. He threw his hands into the air and shouted. I only fixed what should have been mine in the first place. The courtroom froze. Absolutely froze. Even Dad seemed to realize what he'd just said. A second too late. Because you can't claim a will never existed and then admit you fixed the outcome. Those two things don't belong in the same sentence. Voss closed his eyes. Literally closed his eyes. Like a man wishing he could disappear. Judge Hollis stared at my father for several seconds, then calmly ordered him back into his seat. This time the bailiff took a step forward. And suddenly Dad decided sitting was a good idea. The damage was done.
Completely.
Irreversibly.
Done.
For the rest of the hearing, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The evidence had spoken. The witnesses had spoken. And now my father had spoken. Against himself. Then something unexpected happened. Cole stood up. Folks, I still remember that moment.
Because it cost him something.
A lot. Cole looked terrified. But he stood anyway. And when Judge Hollis allowed him to speak, he told the truth. He admitted signing paperwork without reading it. He admitted trusting Dad. He admitted believing everything was routine. Then he looked directly at the judge. I don't want anything that came from a forged deed or a missing will. The room went silent again. Then he withdrew his support for Dad's appointment as administrator. Right there. On the record. Folks, that took courage. Real courage. The kind that doesn't get talked about enough. Because standing against a parent isn't easy. Even when you know they're wrong. After a short recess, Judge Hollis returned. And then came the moment we'd all been waiting for. Her ruling was straightforward.
Clear. Direct.
And devastating for my father. She found that the evidence proved Grandpa's will existed. She found the witness testimony credible. She found the copy reliable. She found the missing original was most likely the result of interference rather than innocent loss. Then she admitted Walt Mays' will to probate. Officially. Legally.
Permanently.
My father was immediately removed as administrator of the estate. The questionable property transfers were ordered reviewed and corrected. Improper fees were ordered repaid. And the matter involving the deed transfers and missing documents was referred to the county prosecutor for further review. No dramatic music played. Nobody cheered. Life doesn't work that way. But for the first time since Grandpa's funeral, justice finally showed up. The months afterward were quieter. The way Grandpa would have preferred. The store and family home passed jointly to Cole and me, exactly as Grandpa intended. Dad received the inheritance Grandpa left for him. Nothing more. Nothing less. The land connected to the questionable transfers returned to the estate. The financial damage was repaired as much as possible. And the people who helped create the mess suddenly became very interested in settling things quietly. As for Dad, well, consequences have a funny way of arriving eventually. Sometimes slower than we'd like, but they arrive. The following November, I unlocked the front door of May Brothers Feed and Grain. For the first time in months, the old brass bell rang overhead, exactly the way it always had. I stepped inside. The smell of grain dust filled the air. The sunlight hit the counter. And sitting exactly where it belonged was Grandpa's green ledger. For a moment, I just stood there, listening, remembering, breathing. Then I smiled, because the fight was over. The truth had won, and Grandpa's wishes were finally being honored. These days, Cole runs the yard operations.
He does a good job. Steady.
Responsible. Reliable. But before we signed the partnership papers, I gave him one rule. Just one. The books stay honest. He nodded. Immediately. Because now he understood what Grandpa had been trying to teach us all along. Numbers matter. Truth matters. Character matters. And being the quiet person in the family? That never meant being the weak one. Not once. Sometimes the quiet ones are simply paying attention. And when the truth finally needs defending, they're the ones who know exactly where to find it. If this story taught us anything, it's this. Read the paperwork. Ask questions. And never assume a missing document means the truth disappeared with it. Because sometimes all it takes is one witness, one receipt, and one honest ledger to bring everything into the light. And if you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one people overlooked, the one nobody expected to stand up, remember this. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Never did. Never will. Thanks for listening, folks. And I'll see you in the next story.